On November the 20th, 1998, someone started to write threatening letters to the German rail operator, Deutsche Bahn. He demanded the railway hand over the equivalent of £3 million in Deutschmarks. Otherwise, passengers would die. The author claimed to represent former railway employees made redundant by the company. Assuming it was the work of a harmless crank, Deutsche Bahn chose to ignore the letter. But this man was not as harmless as they thought. A week later, he sent a second letter, and still hearing nothing from Deutsche Bahn, the blackmailer took action. Choosing a section of track in the town of Wilmersdorf, he loosened one of the rails. Fortunately for Deutsche Bahn, the loose rail was spotted and repaired before any train passed over it. At Deutsche Bahn headquarters, no connection was made with the blackmailer. Writing increasingly aggressive letters, the blackmailer threatened a major rail disaster in the Berlin region if Deutsche Bahn still failed to respond. To show its willingness to pay up, the railway considered placing an advert in a Berlin newspaper. 5 days later, Deutsche Bahn, struck by the unusual persistence of the letters, decided to take no chances and placed the ad. But to avoid bad publicity, they tried to conceal what was going on by making it look like an ordinary promotion. They were too clever for their own good. So obscure was the telephone number that the blackmailer didn't notice it.
Die Katastrophe in Eschede ist für die Deutsche Bahn.
The Eschede disaster was the writing on the wall for Deutsche Bahn.
Jeder Angriff auf diesen Hochgeschwindigkeitszug.
Any attack on this high-speed train or on its tracks is especially dangerous, and for the rail company and the public, it's a sensitive issue.
So ist das ja bei dem Fall Uchtspringe auch gewesen. Deutsche Bahn konnte es auf keinen.
This is how it was in the Uchtspringe case. The German rail company could on no account accept a high-speed train being hit by an attacker in this way.
In dieser Weise getroffen wird.
The blackmailer meant business, and Deutsche Bahn didn't know where to look.
An emergency staff was put into action as is customary in these circumstances. You must bear in mind that as soon as it became obvious how serious the threats were, new attacks had to be expected every day. Nobody knew how many people were involved, in what way or in what place they would strike next.
Faced with the task of policing a huge rail network, they focused their efforts on the high-speed lines. The German Air Force flew reconnaissance missions, looking for signs of the blackmailer. Unaware that Deutsche Bahn were placing further adverts to try and make contact, the blackmailer struck again, this time choosing the line running through the town of Anklam. He made sure he would have a derailment this time. A freight train traveling north was derailed in spectacular fashion. The driver was lucky to survive. It could have been much worse. A high-speed passenger train had been due to pass the site of the derailment. If it hadn't been delayed by half an hour, it would have run straight into the wreckage. Deutsche Bahn now had no choice. They announced to the nation that the derailment had been an act of sabotage and made an appeal to the blackmailer to get in touch. By now it was December the 10th, and Germany was preparing for Christmas.
Many people were considering traveling by train in order to avoid the Christmas rush and sitting in traffic jams. The blackmail attempt and the derailed train acted like a bomb under the general public, especially as Deutsche Bahn went public immediately and said, yes, we are being blackmailed.
Desperate to make contact with the blackmailer before he struck again, Deutsche Bahn issued a telephone number and appealed for him to phone in. The risk was the publicity would drive the blackmailer further underground. The risk paid off. He had been watching the television and called in later that evening. Having put the German nation into a state of panic, would he now succeed in his bid to extort a ransom? The man he spoke to at Deutsche Bahn was not an employee of the railway, but a police officer specially trained in the psychology of negotiation.
Der Beamte der Kriminalpolizei vom
A CID officer from the Federal Criminal Investigation Office conducted the phone calls with the attacker and proceeded in such a manner to strike up a bond of trust.
geführt und ist so vorgegangen, dass erstmal ein Vertrauensverhältnis aufgebaut hat.
He said to the saboteur immediately, "We shall deal with your demands fully," thus persuading him not to carry out any more attacks on the rail network under any circumstances.
In den Zugverkehr der Bahn einzugreifen.
The police officer's strategy was to befriend the blackmailer, to get him to reveal details about himself that would allow the police to track him down and make an arrest. All this took time, and meanwhile Deutsche Bahn was losing money.
The level of media response that went with it, headlines all over Germany, caused a lot of confusion and uncertainty amongst the population. Because of the serious nature of this attack and of this blackmail attempt, many people made alternative arrangements. They just didn't go by train.
48 hours after he had first called, the blackmailer agreed to a rendezvous to collect 10 million Deutschmarks. He told police he would be coming alone and would not be carrying a weapon. The police had done everything they could. They now had to have faith in their strategy and go in for an arrest. The money was to be handed over at a petrol station in Bavaria. An undercover police officer drove in a black Mercedes to deliver the cash. It had been agreed the driver would sit in the car and wait for the blackmailer to approach. The money was to be in a briefcase in the boot. He walked straight into the trap. The blackmailer had his hands on the money for only a few seconds before he was arrested. Klaus-Peter Sabotta was naive enough to believe there would be no police present at the rendezvous. He was charged with attempted murder and extortion. 1 year later, he was sentenced to life imprisonment.